Welcome to the channel. So I'm going to start the story. I stood in front of the mirror in the elevator looking at my reflection. Everything seemed familiar and new at the same time. I smoothed my hair, adjusted my jacket. Small but familiar movements. At that moment, a strange feeling swept over me. Despite all the confidence I had in me, I could feel a slight anxiety becoming part of my mood. I had accomplished a lot over the years, but today was the moment when everything I had created was going to be recognized. The promotion I had dreamed of for so long was now a reality. Senior Director of Marketing. So much work and effort put into my career was finally being rewarded. The numbers on the elevator screen kept going up, 12, 13, 14, and now finally 15. I was almost there. Each digit brought me closer to these important minutes that were to be the culmination of my journey. I caught myself thinking that all of this was the result of not only growing professionally, but also fighting the doubts that sometimes visited me along the way. But in that moment, I felt that it was all mine, that I deserved this recognition. Despite all my accomplishments, thoughts of Jacob came back to me. He had been there for me since the beginning. We met at the same company. He was my support person, and even when things were difficult, he was always there for me. But today, something wasn't right. His behavior seemed strange. His gaze was aloof, and I couldn't help but notice it. It was as if something was changing in him, something I couldn't explain. My thoughts about work slowly began to intermingle with thoughts about what was going on in our lives. I could feel the anxiety creeping into me more and more. The elevator came to a discreet stop and the doors opened. I stepped into the lobby and the atmosphere of the office space filled me with new emotions. The room was full of people, coworkers, congratulations, and genuine smiles. But despite all this joy and attention, I couldn't help but feel a strange detachment within me. I was surrounded by colleagues, and they were warmly congratulating me. But something in their faces made me feel that their joy was just a polite framing of the moment, not a sincere recognition of my success. Even as I accepted the congratulations, I lacked the sincerity I had grown accustomed to. Soon, amidst all the congratulations, I noticed Jacob. He was standing in the corner watching, his eyes seeming distant, though he was smiling. I walked over to him, and his reaction was the same, warm, but kind of reserved. He kissed me on the cheek and said, "Congratulations, dear. It's well deserved." However, I noticed something in his voice that wouldn't easily escape notice. It wasn't something I was used to hearing. He was there for me, but his eyes didn't have that glow in them that was usually present when he was near me. I felt everything around me grow a little dimmer, and my thoughts began to wander. Jacob used to be my main support person, but now it felt like there was an invisible wall between us. His behavior, his silence, his aloofness, all of it was a mystery to me. Even with all the joy of the promotion, I couldn't rid myself of the thought that something was happening to him, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Why was it that now, on this day, when I should have felt proud, I felt only mild anxiety? Later, sitting in my office and continuing to work, I tried to gather my thoughts. Sarah, my assistant, had brought the paperwork for me to sign, and her words couldn't distract me from the thought that something was wrong. I kept working, checking the reports, but thoughts of Jacob wouldn't let go. All the silence between us, his strange detachment, it was all starting to fill my mind. Why had he become like this? We used to be a team, but now it was like he wasn't here, but somewhere far away. I tried to ignore these thoughts, but as the days went by, I found myself seeing his attitudes and actions in a different light. I decided I had to talk to him, even though I knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. But was it worth it? I didn't want to ruin our marriage, ruin everything we'd built. But inwardly, I was beginning to feel that this moment was inevitable. Breathing in, I focused on getting my work stuff done. Perhaps this anxiety was simply the result of stress, but on another level, I knew that this feeling wouldn't go away until I had a frank conversation with him. I stayed in my office until late into the evening, trying to cope with the growing anxiety. Even as my colleagues dispersed, I continued to ponder what was behind his behavior. Although I couldn't understand exactly what was going on in our marriage, I knew I couldn't ignore the feelings that were beginning to build up. When it was time to leave, I noticed that Jacob hadn't come home on time again. I felt the anxiety building up inside of me. By nightfall, I couldn't sit still anymore. The hours dragged on and I could feel the time wasting away. I thought about how, just yesterday, Jacob had been the closest thing I had to a man, the person I could share absolutely everything with. But now I couldn't help but notice how his blank stare and silence were pulling him away from me. I stood in silence, listening to the rain dripping outside the window, and I could feel my anxiety growing. When Jacob finally returned, I sensed that this was a critical moment. He was still avoiding my gaze, and despite everything he'd said, there was something in that silence that told me there was no longer the trust between us that we'd once had. He tried to approach me, but I pulled away. I was ready to talk, but I didn't know how to start. "Are you hiding something to me, Jacob?" I asked, looking him straight in the eye. His reaction was instantaneous, and I knew right away that he knew it was coming out. He fell silent, and I couldn't delay this conversation any longer. We both knew that this moment was crucial. Morning came, and I struggled to force myself to get up. The sun was barely breaking through the curtains, but everything felt foreign. Everything was not the way it was supposed to be. I arrived at the office feeling not only physically tired, but with a heavy weight in my chest. I couldn't get the conversation with Jacob out of my mind. His silence, his attempts to justify himself. I could feel the world changing around me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He was there, but he was far away, and it felt like he wouldn't let me go. When I walked into the office, it was quiet. The whole day passed in this cloudy feeling of uncertainty. The holiday seemed far away and success seemed somehow empty. I sat at my desk surrounded by files and paperwork, but all I could think about was what was going on between Jacob and me. My gaze was fixed on the phone. He hadn't texted me anything after our conversation. He hadn't tried to justify himself, and I wasn't ready to forgive. I didn't know what was going on, and maybe I was worrying too much, but the doubts wouldn't leave me. Emails from coworkers and messages about a new project didn't help distract me. I felt on edge. There was a struggle inside me between giving Jacob a chance and not letting his silence be the reason for what we were building, and realizing that there were too many unanswered questions. I missed the sincerity in his words, and I found myself questioning his motives more and more often. What if all of this, his detachment, were just signals that I didn't want to accept? Half the day passed in idle hustle and bustle, until Sarah, my assistant, came up with some new assignments. I took a deep breath and decided I needed to take my mind off Jacob to focus on work. But it wasn't that simple. When I got back to the paperwork, my thoughts kept returning to him. I knew I couldn't ignore it, and soon I would have to make a choice. An hour passed, and it was as if everything had slowed down. I checked my phone, but there were still no messages from him. I tried to stay calm, but deep down everything was tormenting me. I stood up and walked to the window. The view of the city was soothing, but it didn't bring me relief. I knew I had to deal with this, not put off the conversation that was to be had. When I got home that evening, I had a hard time deciding to talk to Jacob. We were side by side, but there was a silence so thick in the air that every step seemed to break its fragility. He was sitting on the couch, absorbed in some sort of activity on his phone. I could feel his absence, his detachment draining the last of my strength. I walked over and sat next to him, but his gaze wasn't on me. It was on the screen of his device. "You're late again, Jacob," I said quietly, but there was tension in my voice. He looked up but didn't say anything right away. His eyes were cold, like he was preparing for something but didn't want to say it. "You know how hard this whole work thing is," he finally said, but his words didn't give me satisfaction. It was too easy. I wanted more. I needed an explanation, something sincere. I couldn't understand why he was acting like this. Why was there so much silence between us now? I understand that work is important, I began, trying to control my voice. But something's going on, Jacob. You're getting farther and farther away from me. It's not okay. He looked at me, and I saw his face go slightly pale, but he didn't respond. At that moment, I realized that the conversation I had been putting off for so long was finally going to happen. I couldn't stand this silence any longer. I couldn't allow myself to be deceived and expect him to make excuses again like he had before. I knew there was a crack in our marriage, and if I didn't speak up, the whole thing would just keep falling apart. I can't wait any longer, Jacob. You have to tell me what's going on, why you've become like this, why you can't talk to me. His face turned red, but he didn't answer. We sat in silence, and I knew that this conversation could change everything. A few minutes of silence passed, and I was beginning to think that maybe I wouldn't get an answer. Jacob looked like he didn't know what to say. The silence was becoming unbearable. I tried to get him to look at me, but his eyes were still hidden behind an opaque wall. I felt something clench inside me. It was all too painful. "You can't just keep avoiding me, Jacob," I said, trying not to snap. But my composure was on edge. I could feel how quickly I was losing control, how his silence was destroying everything I'd once thought was important. "You know how I feel. You know I can't just ignore what's going on between us." He finally put the phone down on the table and looked at me, but his gaze wasn't what it used to be. There wasn't the confidence, the warmth with which he used to look at me. It was a look that left more questions than it answered. He sighed, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. "You don't understand," he finally uttered. His words were as if held back, as if he was afraid that anything he said would only make things worse. I felt that "you don't understand" hit me. I'd always understood him, always been there for him, but in that moment I felt him losing me. "You can trust me, Jacob. You have to tell me the truth," I insisted. My voice became firm. This was the moment when I knew I couldn't let him keep hiding everything anymore. He had to be honest with me. He was silent for a long time, then slowly looked up and spoke. I don't know where to begin." It felt more like a confession than an explanation, and despite everything he said, I already knew this truth was going to be painful. "Are you cheating on me, Jacob?" I asked, and there was emptiness in my voice. I felt my heart freeze. It wasn't just a question. It was an admission that something about him had changed. He remained silent. His gaze didn't meet my eyes. "I can't go on like this, Jacob," I said, but it was hard for me to say the words. I could feel all the energy drain from my words, and his silence turned into more pain. He looked at me again, but now his eyes didn't have the emotion that had been so vivid before. He seemed ready to give up on this conversation, but at that moment something in his expression changed. He slowly stood up, and it seemed like all of his actions were dictated by something he couldn't stop. He walked across the room and sat down again, but now I could see that this conversation was no longer in his hands. We were standing on the edge of something that couldn't be turned back. "You're right," he said, but his voice sounded restrained, as if he couldn't fully acknowledge his actions. I made a mistake, and I might not be able to make it right." That admission wasn't a relief to me. It was just an admission that his words no longer meant what they once meant. It was as if we no longer spoke the same language. I stood there, feeling the weight of those words. I knew that this conversation wouldn't solve anything, that it wouldn't bring back what I had. All I could do was realize that I could no longer be in this marriage, in this relationship, where trust had been broken. We sat in silence, and then I said what I had been meaning to say for a long time. "I can't be with you anymore, Jacob." The words came out hard, but they were true. I knew I couldn't continue on this path. I couldn't keep him by my side if things between us weren't what they were supposed to be. He couldn't come back into my life. "I don't know what to do," he said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice that he probably didn't want to face. But I had already made my decision. This whole situation with him and Rebecca left me with no choice. "I know what to do," I replied. I felt like the words I spoke were final. "I need to be me. I need to get away from you." It had been a few days since I had made my final decision, and although I tried to get back to normal, each new day brought a sense of heaviness. Work tasks, meetings, and phone calls all kept me busy. But thoughts of Jacob continued to haunt me. I couldn't shake off what we'd been through, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't stay in it. I couldn't be in a relationship where everything I thought I had was ruined. This morning, when I arrived at the office, I felt a strange calmness. It was as if I had gained control of my life. The room was quiet, and I sat down at my desk, opening another set of reports and documentation. Everything was the same as always: coworkers, meetings, tasks. But underneath this superficial calm, everything inside me was going differently. I could feel my perspective on everything going on changing. I couldn't just carry on as before, ignoring what I needed to do. It was important to move on. The day passed rather quickly, and in the evening I found myself home again. Edward was late at work as usual. We didn't talk. I realized that this silence had become habitual for us. We were no longer a team. He was there for me, but I could feel him drifting away. We were starting to really lose touch, and I felt it in every encounter we had. That night was unlike any night before. I made dinner, but this time there was something in the air that said something was different. I waited for him to come home, and when he walked in, his gaze was as cold as before. We were back in this space of silence that only reinforced my feeling that I couldn't stay in this relationship any longer. When we sat down to dinner, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I couldn't allow myself to hide everything that was going on inside of me. This conversation that we were both avoiding was inevitable. I realized that despite everything I had been through, I could no longer stay in a relationship that had already lost its value. I looked him in the eye and said what I should have said a long time ago. "Edward, I need you to come clean about what's going on. I can't live in ignorance anymore. I can't continue in a relationship that has become foreign to me." He fell silent, but I could see him about to say something. His silence became familiar to me. He tried to justify himself, but I already knew he wasn't going to say anything. I knew that this conversation was crucial. He didn't answer right away, but I saw his face change. He stood in front of me like a man who had been caught in a lie. His look when he looked up became more desperate. He tried to find the words, but they wouldn't come. "You don't understand," he said, as if his own words weren't finding their way out. I noticed his hand shaking as he leaned on the table. It felt like a confession, though he didn't say it. I felt my inner strength begin to increase. I knew this conversation had to end with an answer. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. "I know you betrayed me," I said, almost without emotion, though there was a lot of pain in my soul. "I know that you and Rebecca, there's something between you. I can't hide it from myself anymore." My words hung in the air. He fell silent, and I realized there was more to his silence than I would have realized right away. He couldn't answer me because maybe it was all too obvious. He started to make excuses, but his words seemed empty. "You know how important this project is, how hard it's been to work all these weeks. Rebecca and I are just co-workers. I didn't want this to affect us in any way." But I didn't believe him anymore. I couldn't. His words sounded like nothing in my ears. All I could see was him with her, was his silence, his avoidance of me. I sighed, feeling the pain shoot through me. But I couldn't go back. All of it, he, her, their silence was destroying me from the inside out, and I knew I couldn't go on any longer. Jacob sat across from me. silent as if holding his breath, and I could feel the heaviness in the air becoming unbearable. Every movement he made seemed slowed, every word as if he was afraid it would come out and change everything. I knew there had to come a moment when he would have to tell the truth, but instead he remained silent. Only his eyes, full of confusion and fear, gave away that he understood how it had ended. "You can't stay silent anymore, Jacob," I said, my voice hard, even cold. This was the moment when I could no longer allow myself to doubt. When the truth had to be spoken out loud, I couldn't go on with this spectacle any longer. I wanted answers. He finally looked up, but it wasn't the expression I was used to seeing in his eyes. They used to be full of love, support, and concern, but now they were only confusion and guilt. "I didn't know how to say it," he said, his voice trembling, and in it I heard the same pain that burned me. But I couldn't be soft anymore. "You didn't know how to say it?" I questioned, but inwardly I already knew the answer. He just didn't want to say it. He was avoiding it. Avoided the truth. Avoided me. It was all so obvious. He couldn't hide his guilt anymore, but he also couldn't admit to having another woman. "Are you cheating on me, Jacob?" I asked. My heart clenched, but I couldn't go back. This was the moment of truth. He had to answer. He looked as if he'd been caught in the act. His eyes avoided my gaze, his lips trembling slightly. I saw his breathing become ragged. He shook his head, but his face gave everything away. "I was wrong," he said, but his words were helpless, as if they couldn't come back to reality. He seemed like a man who realized the consequences of his actions too late. "You can't just say that," I uttered, feeling my patience running out. "You betrayed me, Jacob. You betrayed us." My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would be audible in the room. But despite all the pain, I felt a strength awaken inside me. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I wasn't going to let him get away with it again. He opened his mouth as if he was going to say something, but he fell silent again. All he could do was sit there in front of me and be silent. I felt the silence between us grow more and more tense. There was nothing left for us to go back to the way things were. Everything that had been was over. The silence continued. I sat staring at him, trying to figure out what he was feeling at this moment. But I didn't see the remorse in his eyes like I expected. I didn't see the pain I should have seen. All I felt was disappointment. Disappointment that all of this had happened, that the man I trusted, the man who had been by my side for so many years, couldn't keep from ruining everything we had built. "I can't forgive you, Jacob," I said, and the words came out of me like something heavy and painful. But they were true. I couldn't forgive him, and I knew I couldn't. Those words became final, like a stamp on a document. His eyes were full of tears, but I couldn't feel an ounce of regret. I didn't want to be with him anymore. My heart was closed to him. We could talk about what had happened, but it didn't matter anymore. I had made a decision, and it was a firm one. I couldn't be with him anymore. We couldn't be the people we used to be. What I saw in front of me was not the Jacob I had started to build my life with. Inwardly, I could feel the pain leaving, setting me free. The words I spoke were the key that opened the door to a new life. I couldn't be in this marriage anymore. I couldn't be in this relationship that no longer brought me joy, only pain. I stood up, looked at him one last time, and said, "I'm leaving." That was the end, and I knew I wasn't coming back. Everything seemed strange when I woke up the next morning. I got up early before I could even really sleep, and found that the morning that was supposed to be special to me had become unbearably empty. I sat on the edge of my bed, consumed with thoughts, not knowing how to start the new day. My body, tired with nerves, still felt the weight of the night I'd finally made my decision. Jacob was gone. We were no longer husband and wife, and that was final. I never thought I would be in this situation, but now I knew I had to move forward. I couldn't go back to the relationship that once seemed so perfect. Everything that was had fallen apart like a house of cards, and while I felt pain, I also felt relief. With each new step I took in the process, I could feel the strength building up. I began to realize that this was my life, my freedom, and I wasn't going to let anyone else control it. He was gone, but now I had to take responsibility for my own life. This was my time, and I had to take advantage of it. I was ready. I could feel the inner barrier that held me captive to this situation slowly crumbling. I was ready to start something new. My coworkers didn't know everything that had happened, but I didn't need to explain every step of the way. I no longer felt the need to justify myself to anyone. It was my choice, and I no longer questioned it. I had walked away from him, and now I was ready to build my life anew. Before heading to work, I took one more look at my phone. There were many unread messages, including one from Sarah, my assistant, who congratulated me on the successful completion of the project. That was important. But there was no question in my mind about how I would look in the eyes of others. I felt myself freeing myself from those thoughts. With each new step, I felt like everything around me was beginning to take on new hues. I was no longer Jacob's wife. I was a woman who had just found her freedom. The feeling was incredible, though scary. The world wasn't as I knew it, but now I could see it differently. I could build my own path, my own career, and my own life. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need anyone but myself. I was ready for the changes the future would bring. The whole day passed like a blur. Everything was familiar but different. Work, meeting with coworkers, projects. Everything went on as usual. I started my tasks, and each new step was like the familiar, but not the usual. My mind was preoccupied with only one thing: the feeling of new freedom. Even so, there was room in my mind for other thoughts. When evening came, I returned home and felt the tension that held me in chains finally begin to fade. This place that had once been home now seemed foreign to me. I walked into our living room, my gaze sliding over the empty chair, the place where he always sat. I felt the emptiness pervade me, but at the same time, I knew this was the beginning of something new. I felt a complete cleansing taking place. No more questions, no more doubts. This was my time. Looking in the mirror, I noticed that I looked different. I wasn't the woman I used to be. It was gone, leaving room for a new version of myself. She had more confidence, more determination. And although this change came through pain, it brought light with it. I began to realize that I was stronger than I ever thought I was. With each new day, I could feel my strength coming back to me. All that I had lost was now a part of me, a part of my growth. I didn't know what was ahead of me, but I knew this journey would be mine. I couldn't and wouldn't go back. This was final. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and realized that I didn't need anyone else to be happy now. It was enough for me to be me. It had been a few weeks since I had finally made the decision to leave Jacob and start a new life. It has been a difficult time, full of change and self-reflection. Every morning when I woke up, I could feel the air in the house lighter, but at the same time, it felt empty. I no longer felt that sense of restlessness that used to be a part of my day, and it was both liberating and frightening. Every time I walked past our shared spot where he once sat reading the paper or preparing for meetings, I felt a strange sense of loss, but it wasn't painful. It was more like saying goodbye to a part of myself, a part of my life that was already gone, leaving me here to build something new. I accepted it as an inevitable process, and I no longer wanted to pretend that I could take it all back. Every day, I grew stronger. I became more and more immersed in my work, in the career challenges I could now take on without looking back to anyone else. It was a strange feeling, like I was finally free of something that held me in fear. With each project, each client meeting, I grew more confident, and thoughts of Jacob less and less frequently crossed my mind. I was no longer looking for excuses for his behavior. I was ready to move forward. One day, when I got home late at night, I decided I needed to make a change. I didn't want to stay in that house, which now seemed empty and meaningless to me. I decided to sell it. It was a big step, but I knew it was the right decision. Selling the house was like a final release. I couldn't stay where there were so many memories of Jacob, where every corner reminded me of what had been and what was now gone. As I signed the papers and handed over the keys to the new owner, I felt all that weight inside me finally go away. I was no longer a woman waiting for things to change. I was a woman who was deciding for herself what was going to happen next, and it was an amazing feeling. I was standing at a new beginning in my life. After selling my house, I moved into a small but cozy apartment downtown. It was like a fresh start that I had created for myself. Spacious, but not huge, it was my new sanctuary. It was easy to breathe here, easy to feel like I could be myself. I chose a style that reflected my personality, minimalism and light colors that created an atmosphere of calm and harmony. It was now my space, where I could be whoever I wanted to be and where my feelings were safe. In the first few weeks, I felt a little lost. The habit of living with someone, of sharing space, was becoming a thing of the past. But as each day went by, I became more confident. I learned to enjoy solitude again, stopped being afraid of it. I could spend evenings with a book or watching movies I had long forgotten about. I resumed old hobbies that I hadn't had time to maintain in recent years. It was like coming back to myself, the woman I was before my life changed. I became more active in going out with friends, spending time with coworkers. We had parties and weekend getaways. It became part of my new self, an independent, driven woman who wasn't afraid to start fresh. And while I sometimes felt like I missed the support I once had, I no longer saw it as a loss. I realized that in order to be strong, I didn't need to lean on anyone. I could only rely on myself. As time went on, I realized that my life was becoming more and more what I wanted it to be. I set new goals for myself and no longer looked for excuses or limitations in them. I was ready to move forward. At that moment, I felt that this new phase was not just a recovery phase for me, but a moment of real upheaval. Everything that had gone before was behind me, and now I could build my life without looking back. It had been a few months since I'd left Jacob and started a new life. It was like starting a new chapter, and with each passing day, I could feel the fog from the past slowly dissipating, giving way to clarity. I felt like every new endeavor was getting easier and easier. My world was no longer filled with the weight of loss and unresolved issues. I was ready to explore new horizons, find joy in what I was doing, and begin to truly enjoy life. All of these changes seemed almost unbelievable, but I knew they were the right ones. As I started working on a new project, feeling confident in my abilities, I realized how much I had been missing that very freedom, to be in charge, to make decisions, without having to look back at other people's expectations. I started looking for goals for myself again. I wanted to prove to myself that I could be successful without him, that I could be happy without attachment. And every day as I moved toward those goals, I felt myself regain my power. I was no longer the woman who depended on someone else's opinion. I was my own backbone. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to move forward, I sometimes had moments of emptiness in my life, the feeling that something was missing. I missed the simple conversations, the days when everything seemed simple and clear. But no matter how hard I tried to bring back something from the past, I realized it was impossible. Jacob and I were too different, and there was no going back. Everything that had gone before had become part of my history, part of what I had left behind. My evenings were quiet now. I would come home, cook dinner, sometimes watch old movies or read books. It was all familiar, but I was no longer alone in this. I enjoyed my own company. I started socializing with people I hadn't seen in a while, going out again to meet friends. Sometimes I was invited to business dinners or corporate events, but it didn't bring me the pain I had once felt when it seemed that all those joys were just an illusion. Each new morning, despite its calmness, brought a sense of strength. I no longer woke up with a heavy weight on my heart. Instead, I woke up with a clear purpose: to build my life without the past, without regrets. I realized that the time that had passed had become a part of me, but it didn't define my future. My gaze was directed only forward, and that gaze was full of determination. One night, as I was coming home late, I noticed him. Jacob was standing at the door of our old house, as if he hadn't left the whole time. He looked at me with a longing that was instantly recognizable. I felt my whole inner world suddenly stop. His presence in my life drew me in again like a magnet. He stood on the threshold like a man trying to get back to where he had already left. And I knew that this was a moment that could change everything. But I also knew that I shouldn't give in. All this time, all these months, I had been building my life anew, and I couldn't afford to be back in the place I had already been. I was on the threshold of a new beginning, and I couldn't let the past destroy my inner harmony again. "I thought you might want to talk," he said, his voice quiet, full of remorse. It was exactly what I'd been afraid of, that he'd come apologizing again, with explanations I didn't want to hear anymore. He looked as if he wanted something back, but his gaze was filled not only with remorse, but regret. I couldn't let myself be the woman who believed in empty words again. I stared into his eyes and felt the pain reawaken inside me. He wasn't who I thought he was. All of his actions, all of his words now seemed like part of a game I no longer wanted to play. "I can't talk to you right now," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "You left and you made your choice. But I made my choice too." I didn't know what words he wanted to hear, but I knew I couldn't be a part of his world anymore. I couldn't let him meddle in my life again because it was my life and only I could decide what to do with it. He was silent for a long time, and I could feel his gaze growing more and more detached. He realized that his words no longer mattered. I was determined, and his regrets could no longer change me. That was the moment I finally closed the door to my past. I turned and walked to my apartment, leaving him standing there on the doorstep. I woke up the next morning with a slight sense of release. Everything I had experienced seemed so distant, almost foreign to me. I no longer felt the past weighing down on me, its weight preventing me from moving forward. Jacob was no longer a part of my life, and I couldn't let myself go back to being the woman who lived in his shadow. I could fall back into that magnetism I'd once trusted so much, but now I knew it didn't lead to happiness. My life belonged to me alone. With each new day, I could feel my strength returning to me. Morning started with coffee and a short morning routine, easy and without too much fuss. I woke up with the confidence that the day would be a success, and all I had to do was move step by step towards my new goals. I no longer looked for approval in my actions. I didn't wait for someone else's words of encouragement. I was only looking for my own solutions. When I returned to the office, my coworkers congratulated me on the successful completion of the new project I was leading. Everything seemed normal. Everything was going according to plan. But I couldn't help but notice how the same coworkers with whom I had once shared joys and challenges were now becoming strangers to me. Their smiles were no longer as genuine as they used to be. I tried not to think about the fact that they might be discussing me behind my back, but I knew. I couldn't let myself go back to being that woman who was afraid of what others might think of her. The past months had made me stronger. I had learned to respect and value myself, and that was important. Throughout my life, I had tried to please others, but now I realized that I could no longer conform to other people's expectations. I was ready to be myself. There was something liberating about that willingness. It had become my new reality, and I wasn't going to change it. In the evening, I went to meet some friends. It was something I hadn't done in a long time. We met at a new cafe, and I felt the fresh air fill me with new energy. I could be myself again, without filters, without fear. We talked, we laughed, but I was, inwardly, deeply grateful to these people for being there for me. They had become not only friends to me, but part of this new phase of my life. It wasn't just recovery from a crisis, it was a true rebirth. I was ready to build my path anew without looking back at old mistakes and lost relationships. I was coming home with a light heart. I was able to enjoy my time again, to spend it the way I wanted to. I realized that it didn't matter so much what was in the past. What mattered was what was ahead. After a few weeks, I felt the change again. Despite all the confidence I had built up, something was still unfinished. Thoughts of what had happened with Jacob sometimes popped into my head. I could still remember those moments when he'd sat in our house and looked at me with that look on his face that left me pensive. His face full of remorse was unforgettable. But I realized that I didn't need to revisit those memories. I was a woman who had survived and came out of it stronger. At some point, I decided to confront him. I needed to close the circle to finally end the relationship that remained in my life as an open wound. When I arrived at his place, he looked the same as the day I left. There was the same remorse in his eyes that I had seen before, but now it no longer had any power. I was ready to look into his eyes and feel no pain. "You're no longer the man I loved," I said, and those words were more honest than ever before. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking for an explanation. I just realized that our paths had parted and that this meeting wouldn't change anything. He tried to say something, but I wasn't listening anymore. I knew that forgiveness wasn't a commitment. It wasn't something to give if you didn't already want it. I was ready to walk away from all these emotions and put them behind me. I turned around and walked away, closing the door behind me. I didn't look back this time. I felt no bitterness, just calmness, and the realization that there would be no more of the life I had before. All I had to do was move forward. I was ready for a new chapter in which I would be myself, and that was all I needed. It had been a few months since I had finally cut all ties with Jacob. I had gotten used to my new life, and despite all the fears and doubts I had had in the beginning, I now felt strong and confident. Not only had I rebuilt my career, but I had also learned to enjoy my moments of solitude. When you learn to be alone, you begin to appreciate your own company, your own thoughts and actions. There was something liberating about it, something I had sorely lacked in my previous life. I was coming home with a light heart. My new apartment, small and cozy, was full of simplicity and style. I was beginning to feel the space around me fill with life. I didn't have to accommodate anyone, and I could create an atmosphere around me that brought me joy. I could choose how I wanted to spend my evening and not feel pressured. I could read books, watch movies, have an evening out with friends, or just relax on the balcony enjoying the evening air. Although it was hard to get used to being alone at first, I was no longer afraid of it. As time passed, I could feel the confidence blossoming inside me. I was rediscovering the joy of simple things. I learned to enjoy each day without looking back. Work became not only a responsibility, but also a pleasure. I accepted new projects with joy and tried to invest in each case. I realized that it was not only what I did, but how I did it that mattered. But despite all the changes that were happening in my life, I couldn't ignore the moment I stood in front of Jacob as he stood on the doorstep of our former life. There was remorse in his eyes, and I knew he was still trying to get back what was gone. But I wasn't looking for a return anymore. It was what I had experienced, but not the life I wanted to stay in. Every day I became more and more confident in myself. I could look to the future with confidence, and there was no more room for me to have regrets. There was peace in my heart because I realized that I had made the right choice, and that choice made me stronger. I wasn't looking for love in the past. I wasn't trying to get back someone who wasn't mine. I realize now that the real strength was in letting go. A year had passed. My life was completely different now. I could feel the walls I had built around me after leaving Jacob begin to disappear. It It wasn't an instant change, but every day I could feel myself becoming more open. More and more people came into my life, and I stopped being as withdrawn as I used to be. I began to value relationships with friends and coworkers again, who became not only supportive, but also a source of inspiration for me. My professional growth continued. I became a successful leader, and my team supported me every step of the way. I gained confidence in my abilities, and it became easier for me to make important decisions. I felt this whole revitalization process became part of me, part of my strength. I stopped looking back. Everything that had happened, I had put behind me. I didn't need to regret what had happened. I was no longer looking for blame, no longer trying to find what had gone wrong. I already knew it wasn't worth looking to the past for answers if the future was full of possibilities. And though sometimes, when I drove past the old house where Jacob and I had lived, I felt a slight sadness. I no longer longed to go back there. It was just a memory that had no more power. My life was here and now, and I was ready for whatever was ahead of me. I no longer wasted time on regret or jealousy. All I could control was my future. I had made a final decision. Everything I did had to be for me. It was a life of putting myself first, and it was a liberating feeling. I was ready to move forward and build my story, a story that was mine alone. New Year's Eve came unexpectedly, as if everything was happening in an instant. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, which was now a real home, and watched the city fill with lights and sounds of the holidays. There was something magical in the air, a feeling that only new beginnings lay ahead. In that moment, I felt such a deep gratitude for all that has passed and all that is to come. That evening, I didn't worry about not being there for anyone. It was enough that I was with myself, and that was enough. I was no longer searching for meaning in the past and no longer trying to find answers to questions that had once seemed important. Life was now opening up in front of me like an uncharted road full of possibilities, and I was ready to walk down it without stopping. This year was full of changes, but I felt stronger. I rediscovered the joy of small things, morning walks, a cup of hot coffee, evening conversations with friends. These simple pleasures were now more important to me than anything else. I realized that it was in them that the real value of life was hidden. I learned to love myself, to respect my feelings and desires. I began to appreciate moments of solitude and was not afraid to be alone with myself. I went out to meet friends, this time without fear of being caught doing something fake. I savored moments that were real. I no longer looked for emptiness in my surroundings. I was looking for people who made me a better person, people with whom I could share joy and serenity. When I got home late that night, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Lisa, my best friend. We hadn't spoken in a while, but her message came as a reminder that everything I'd experienced was now a part of me, but didn't define me. We agreed to meet up the following week, and I knew she would support me as she always did. I smiled. In that moment, I realized that my whole life was a chain of meetings, conversations, and decisions that I made on my own. Saying goodbye to Jacob had been difficult, but now I realized it was a step in the right direction. He was part of my story, and I accepted that, but I no longer felt pain, no longer felt guilt. I was liberated, and it wasn't just liberation from him, it was liberation from myself. From being the woman who was used to please and fear. I could be myself now, the way I had always been, but I forgot about it for a while. Another month passed. My heart became light, and I didn't need to make excuses anymore. That evening, I sat in my cozy new apartment, watching the night city outside my window. Everything looked the way it should be. I no longer tried to compare my life to what it used to be. I stopped thinking about what could have been if things had turned out differently. My life was here and now, and I was proud of every moment I lived. The tasks I set for myself became easier because I now knew how important it was to be true to myself. I no longer looked to others for approval. I didn't need someone else's perspective on my life. All I needed was to be happy with what I was doing. It was liberating to build my life not according to the expectations of others, but according to my own rules. I was meeting people I loved, and every day I felt my life fill with harmony. It was simple happiness to enjoy the moments without expecting something more. I realized that happiness is not always about finding someone or something, but about being yourself, living in the moment and not being afraid to go your own way. When summer came, I went on a trip I had been planning for a long time. It wasn't about anyone or anything. It was about my desire to see new horizons, to recognize myself in new places and new circumstances. And in that moment, I felt that life had regained its meaning. I returned home with the feeling that all the decisions I had made were the right ones. I was no longer afraid of what awaited me tomorrow. I felt that this was just the beginning, and even though the path I had traveled had been difficult, it had opened up new horizons in front of me. I had become a woman who knew what she wanted and who would no longer hide from her destiny. I had found myself, and it was a wonderful feeling. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Love you, my darlings.